Welcome and good morning. I don't know which mic works. We're glad to have you here. I'm going to direct your attention to all of the announcements in the order of service. My name is Rick Lent, and I'm co-chair of the Climate Task Force. So therefore, I'll give a shout out to the fact that the Climate Task Force has a meeting at 7:30 on Tuesday, and all are welcome to join us on Zoom. So I'll point your attention to those. I thought of one other announcement as I arrived here today that should be made, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong, but our elevator is now working. Yes. So for the first time in I don't know long, the church building is actually fully open to everyone. So give it a try. So, and now turn and greet your neighbor. And say hello to the folks on Zoom. Has everybody on Zoom said hello to everybody else? Okay, good. So we would like to acknowledge that this service is being held by a community that gathers on the stolen traditional lands of the Massachusetts, Nipmuc, Pawtucket, and Wampanoag people. We pay respect to elders who lost their lives in the colonization of this land, and recognize that these indigenous tribes are still today facing violations of sovereignty, territory, and water. We also give thanks for the earth we walk upon, the waters, the life-giving plants, and all the earth's creatures, as well as the winds, sun, moon, and stars. We recognize this is just a first step in moving toward right relationship with the native peoples and healing of the earth.
Good morning. One other brief announcement as we begin. I was asked by one of our small group ministry facilitators saying, well, gosh, I really wish we could have a discussion about Ukraine at church. And so I said, well, we could definitely do that in one of the breakout rooms in the Zoom room after today's service. And so I just wanted to say after this service, you all here in person are invited to have not coffee, but conversation in our fellowship hall. And of course are welcome to engage in any conversations there that you want. And then for those online, if you stay in the main room, instead of going into a breakout room, you can have a discussion about Ukraine there. People wanted to discuss a couple things like, how do we reconcile the fact that we seem to be drawn in and caring more about this and yet maybe not paying as much attention to conflicts as they arise in non-white Western European countries? How do we reconcile our desire to intervene with our desires for peace? How do we struggle with our feelings about pacifism and war? And how do we struggle with our own fears as this awakens trauma responses in us, fears about the Cold War, and so on. So for those kinds of conversations, again, if you're on Zoom, just stay in the main room during the breakout coffee hour time. Our words for calling us to worship this morning are by Joseph M. Cherry. If we have any hope of transforming the world and changing ourselves, we must be bold enough to step into our discomfort, brave enough to be clumsy there, loving enough to forgive ourselves and others. May we, as a people of faith, be granted the strength to be so bold, so brave, and so loving. And our chalice lighting words are by Erica A. Hewitt. And Brad, would you light our chalice this morning? Thanks. The chalice arose as a sign of promise that the marginalized would neither be forgotten nor ignored, because they are beloved and precious and from the perspective of the holy. This morning, we remember all of the people who have been told explicitly or implicitly, through police violence or government policy, through derision or through dehumanization, that they're anything less than whole, anything less than beloved. As we each light a chalice in our homes, and as we light a chalice here together, may we make of our lives a beacon, a symbol of our promise to draw the circle wide, a sign that we will not rest until all means all.
Chalice is not lighting.
Chalice is not lighting.
It's flaming out.
Okay, what I would do is take a tea light and put it in the chalice. Sure. I think it kind of sloshed out a bit overfull in the morning service, in the first service. But we're going to light this tea light for now, and the chalice will get lit, and that will be settled during our first hymn. And Brad's going to introduce that hymn to you. I'm sorry, I'm asking you to do all the things at once.
Our first hymn today is a little different. We're going to be singing a protest song from the 1960s, and we're going to invite you to hum along very strongly, like incredibly strongly. I'm going to sing it once. I'm going to invite the choir to come on up and stand with us. And this song asks the question, or makes the statement, everybody's got a right to live. And so here it is once from me. Everybody's got a right to live. Everybody's got a right to live. And before this campaign fails, we'll all go down to jail. Everybody's got a right to live. Go ahead and come along with us, and we're going to sing strong and up. Everybody's got a right to live. Everybody's got a right to live. And before this campaign fails, we'll all go down to jail. Everybody's got a right to live. Everybody's got a right to what? What else? To what? To joy. Or speak. To speak. Everybody's got a right to what? To water. To water? To have water? Everybody's got a right to love. Everybody's got a right to joy. Let's try joy. Everybody's got a right to joy. Everybody's got a right to joy. And before this campaign fails, we'll all go down to jail. Everybody's got a right to joy. In the first service, one of the youth yelled out to stand up. Let's try stand up. Everybody's got a right to stand up. Everybody's got a right to stand up. And before this campaign fails, we'll all go down to jail. Everybody's got a right to stand up. Please stand and join us in saying our covenant and our affirmation.
Love is the spirit of this church, and service is its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another.
Good morning. I'm going to try that again. Good morning. Oh, that was much better. So, some of you may know, if you know me, that I love children's literature. And some DREs, directors of religious education, don't use children's literature. They make their own stories up. I'm not that talented. So I love to share the books that touch me with you all. And I found this one a couple weeks ago called The Year We Learned to Fly by Jacqueline Woodson. And one of the things that I'm making a commitment right now is I'm going to start sharing the links of these books with you all on FPC Announce so that the people that are on Zoom can also see the title and get a chance to see the pictures as well as you all. And the reason I chose this book is because, like we were just saying that, you know, everyone has the right to live, to stand up, to speak. We all have the right to think. And we are so blessed that in our religion, our Unitarian Universalist faith, that we can think what we want, and no one's telling us that to be part of this church, we have to think a certain way. So I'm going to share this story and share a couple of the reflections, and I hope you enjoy it. That was the year we learned to fly. That was the spring when the rain seemed like it would never stop, and the thunder boomed so hard we weren't allowed to go outside. Use those beautiful and brilliant mind of yours, my grandmother said. Lift your arms, close your eyes, take a deep breath, and believe in a thing. Somebody, somewhere, at some point, was just as bored as you are now. So my brother and I, we closed our eyes, and for a few minutes that first day, we weren't stuck in our apartment anymore. We were flying over the city we'd known our whole lives, but it was suddenly different, exploding with every kind of flower we've ever dreamed of growing. That was the summer we learned to fly, when my brother and I couldn't stop fussing with each other over whose turn it was to wash the windows, to feed the dog, to clean the kitchen. We fought and frowned and made silent promises to never speak to each other ever again. My grandmother said, lift your arms, close your eyes, take a deep breath, and stop being so mean about everything. Somebody, somewhere, at some point, was just as mad as you are now. So we did. And as the soft wind took us out over the city and past the windows of kids who hadn't yet learned to fly, my brother and I reached for each other's hand, flying and diving and laughing and leaving all of our mad far behind us. That was the autumn. Our rooms felt too big and lonely, with only us in them and the darkness coming on so fast. But while we hugged ourselves against the too quiet of it all, we remembered that we didn't have to be stuck anymore anywhere. My grandmother had learned to fly from the people who came before. They were aunts and uncles and cousins who were brought here on huge ships, their wrists and ankles cuffed in iron. But, my grandmother said, nobody can ever cuff your beautiful and brilliant mind. So our people learned to fly, she said. They dreamed a thing and made it happen, closed their eyes and flew away home. Lift your arms, my grandmother said. Close your eyes. And remember, somebody, somewhere, at some point, had to figure out how they could fly. That was the winter we moved away from the building and the block and the friends we'd always known, to a street where the kids looked at us funny and didn't even answer when we asked them if they wanted to play. It's okay, I said to my brother. Somebody, somewhere, at some point, had to figure out they were ready for a new thing coming their way. So like the people who came before us, we lifted our arms even higher, closed our eyes even tighter, breathed in even deeper, and flew the way we'd always known how to, free as the aunties and uncles and cousins who'd come before us, free as our own beautiful and brilliant minds. For a long time, the kids on the ground watched us. Then, one by one, they lifted their arms One by one, they too learned to fly. And you know, every one of us has different ways that we fly, different ways we use our imagination, different ways we think. And our job here is to respect those thoughts, those beliefs from each other, and to support, even if we don't agree, to support the flying of each other, to support the freedom of each other. So as you go through your week, just think about that. Think about how when someone disagrees with you or you have a difference of opinion, it's our job to help them fly, even if we don't agree. Thank you.
If you're wondering why I'm sitting there texting during the story, it's because I realized that my team didn't come into the service but wanted to go to high school discussion group. So I'm texting, time to leave for high school discussion group now. If there's anybody else who would like to depart for a high school discussion group, now's the time.
We're not going to do the Landrum, just get off the news, go to the discussion group. Go down the pathway,
So hopefully they got the text in my office. As you'll see, there are a lot of holes in your order of service. We accidentally printed up an earlier draft of it this week, but your opening words of welcome were Rick Lentz, who's co-chair of our Climate Change Task Force. Joining us for Joys and Sorrows, I believe, is Marcia online, who is going to share those joys and sorrows that we've received in advance. And then I'm going to, since that will mean we have the microphones turned on for people off-site, we'll invite them to share their joys or sorrows first, to be followed by any joys or sorrows of those in the room. If you would like to share joy or sorrow here in the sanctuary, please come forward and use, well, we have to use this microphone for you to be heard online. So we can do it one of two ways. You can come forward to the pulpit if you're comfortable doing that. If not, you can rise and say your joy or sorrow, and I will try to summarize it back into the microphone for folks. Well, that's unusual. None here today. Well, for all those things that we hold in our hearts and minds, may they too be lifted up in beloved community. My colleague Elizabeth Stevens, who's the minister of the UU Church in Moscow, Idaho, wrote this prayer along with an introduction to it to be shared last week and this week about the Ukraine. She says, "This morning, we're going to take an additional moment to acknowledge the way the imperialist mindset continues to threaten people and our precious planet. On Thursday, a week ago, as I'm sure you're aware, Russia launched an attack on Ukraine. This act of aggression has and will continue to upset the balance of power in Europe, and indeed, the whole world. However, I want to name that it feels particularly terrifying in the light of vague threats from Vladimir Putin about what he might do if the US or NATO try to stop him. For those of us who lived through the Cold War, the duck and cover generation, the ones who still have nightmares after watching The Day After, and who cheered on Matthew Broderick in war games, this conflict presses all of our trauma buttons around nuclear war. So, let's breathe into that for a moment. Or if deep breathing isn't right for you, choose some other activity or practice that will help you feel safe and supported here and now. In this moment, there's not much for us to do. But for now, let us pray together. Spirit of life and love, pervasive hope of peace, we add our voices to the chorus of those who align themselves with you. How could this be allowed to happen? When, oh when, will people learn to choose generosity over greed, compassion over aggression, creation over destruction. It is too much. It was too much from the first time someone died for the sake of imperial ambition, and so very, very many have died. Our hearts go out to the people of Ukraine, those wounded and killed, those displaced, dislocated, those lying awake to the sounds of explosions. Help them to know they are not alone. We hold in our hearts as well the people of Russia. Awaken their conscience. Help them to know themselves part of the human family, neither greater nor lesser. May they find the courage to stand up for what is right and just. May they be part of a global movement to hold their leaders accountable. Our own minds, our hands, and our bodies, we pledge once more to the cause of peace, remembering as Lao Tzu taught that peace between nations begins with peace in our hearts. Let us breathe in peace and love. Let us breathe out in peace and love. And let us continue on together. Blessed be, and amen.
Our next hymn is a little different for us. It's not from one of our hymnals. Some of you may be familiar with the book or the movie Just Mercy, and this may speak to you. You may recall that in Just Mercy early on, Brian Stevenson goes to his first death row inmate. He's an intern, and he's nervous because he's to tell this inmate that his prison, his sentencing has been extended indefinitely. They're not sure when the sentencing will happen. And he's not sure how the inmate's going to react. He doesn't know how he's going to respond to this. And it ends up being joy that there's not a time that is set and it's not soon, that it is out and it's still being considered and discussed. And Brian and this man speak for several hours, and at the end of that, the guards kind of forgot that they'd left them in that room, and they come in and they pull them out quickly and try and pull this man from the room, and he plants his feet on the way out and he sings. And he uses his song as an act of resistance and an act of joy. And so this song that's very popular in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, is that song. This is the song that he was singing as he was being pulled from the room. So we offer this today in light of the sermon that is to follow later, and please do feel free to hum along as you pick up on this tune.
Still thinking as I'm onward bound,
Our reading today is from the UUA's book, which is the Common Read book for this year, Defund Fear by Zach Norris. He writes, I want my family to be safe as much as you do, but safe from whom and from what? Who are the most dangerous threats to your family? Are they people in faraway lands, in the inner cities, or people right next door? Are they people you know, from within your country, your community, or even your family? And what really constitutes the worst threat to your family? Is it really crime? Or is it facing eviction because you can't make rent? Is it frequent hospital visits because you live near an oil refinery and your child has asthma? Or because the water you drink is no longer safe? These daily realities are sometimes described as cultural, political, and socioeconomic dynamics, but they are as real as your heartbeat. Decades of funneling money towards a punishment dragnet instead of investing in a real social safety net means one lost job, one healthcare crisis, one traffic stop can be the end of a secure life. This is true whether you live in Oakland, New Orleans, Flint, or anywhere in between. Thus ends the reading. Our plate is shared this month with the Food Project, and we have a video to introduce them, which will be followed by the anthem, which Brad will introduce. And for the good work of their organization and the good work of our church, your gifts will be gratefully received.
Years ago, an idea was born. Bring teens from the city and suburbs together. They would learn what it takes to grow vegetables, experience what it is like to get their hands dirty, to sweat in the hot sun, and to see the rewards of their efforts. And while that was happening, they would come to understand each other's challenges. They would celebrate their differences and find common ground. They would become friends. This is the Food Project.
I'm a 14-year-old teenager that really wanted to get back outside after being stuck in the house for a year and a half.
The first day, I was it was cool seeing like nature, but like I was nervous because it wasn't like a normal job. We had to actually get to know our coworkers and names and try to remember and be friendly.
I actually formed a really good friendship with one of my crew members, Juliana, and she lives in Wayland, Massachusetts. I had never actually even met anybody from Wayland.
Before this job, I had never been to Lincoln or really taken the commuter rail by myself. It's fun. Like, I had a reason to go out to Lincoln. I had never even heard of Lincoln before this job, too.
I feel like everyone has formed such a good connection with each other, and we only see each other once a week, so it just really motivates me to come and see everybody and connect with everybody here on the farm.
Honestly, it's a really hard thing to describe to people that haven't been here because I think there's just so many layers to it. The learning aspect, we do so many workshops to learn about so many different things, the food system, food injustices.
We learned about consent, budgeting and investing, culture sharing.
Public speaking in a group where we knew everybody and we liked everybody. When we came back in the fall, we were doing public speaking in person, and I could see how people have improved and how I improved personally.
And I also think it helped me with being more of an independent girl, with commuting here, getting back, being able to communicate between me and my mom where I'm gonna be, where I'm gonna be there.
I would say my favorite farm job is planting. I think that's everyone's favorite, but for me, I really, really like it because we planted tomatoes the other day, and it was really great because we just got to experience just how the tomatoes grow and all that stuff.
I really enjoyed when I get to pick up the weeds and harvest stuff. Planting is really, enjoyable.
I like to see a little seed become something really big.
We're planting foods that are organic, and we're not adding any chemicals or anything like that. And I feel like that's something lots of people need nowadays because everything's just so unhealthy, so unorganic, and we're giving the community the healthy foods that they need to be given.
Now I don't really buy fruits and vegetables from the supermarket. I go to like farmers markets instead.
It's very rewarding at the end of the day because you see all the things that you've done. You look in the morning, there are weeds covering everything, and you go home at the end of the day and you're looking back when your car's driving away and you see that all the weeds are gone, or you see that the beds are tilled, or you see that all the wheelbarrowing stuff, like this huge pile is completely gone. And honestly, it's kind of fulfilling. You go home, you take a shower, finally, you feel happy. You feel like you've actually done something. You feel like that you've made a difference, that you've like actually completed something, which is really wonderful.
And our anthem for today is a piece called Say Her Name. And we're offering this a little differently today because there's a tremendous video that is available by the composer Alicia Lee, where she leads this. And she wrote this song in response to the murder of Breonna Taylor. And this song she calls not so much a song, but as a practice of liberation, and something that she hopes we can all engage in. And so some members of the choir are going to sing along just from their seats. This repeats itself a bit, and so you'll pick up on the melody. And as it goes, I would encourage you to hum along and engage in the practice that Alicia Lee is bringing forward in this chant and in this song.
"30 years ago,
say her name, say her name, say her name. She cannot be forgotten by us. Say her name, 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 say her name. She cannot be forgotten by us. Say her name, say her name, say her name, say her name. Put her name in the air. 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 Say her name. Say her name. Say her name. Say her name. She cannot be forgotten by us. Say her name. Say her name. Say her name. Say her name. Put her name. Say her name. Say her name. Say her name. She cannot be forgotten by us. Say her name. 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 Breonna Taylor. Say her name. Tatiana Jefferson. Say her name. Say her name. Pamela Turner. Say her name. Say her name. Put his name. Say his name. Philando Castile. Eric Garner. Michael Brown. Say his name. Say their name. Say their name. Say their names. Say their names. They cannot be forgotten by us. Say their names. Say their names. Say their names. Say
want to begin by saying two things. First of all, this sermon will go long. If you need to leave to take attention to your body's needs, please do so. But we're going to go a little over today. Sometimes there is so much to say and so much that I don't want to leave out that's essential to take a little extra time. And while ordinarily I talk too fast, the fact that we're still working on the sound balance in this room and we have a bit of an echo effect is reminding me to take my time and enunciate with my sentences, hopefully. So the speeding up factor won't help with that time issue. I also want to begin by saying something which is always true, but which is worth remembering, particularly on a day when I've had a handful of people tell me in advance that they assume they're going to disagree with what I'm going to say today. That when I'm speaking on something on which we do not all agree, one of the important beliefs in this faith is the belief in the freedom of the pulpit, that you've called me as your minister to a free and untrammeled, as we say, pulpit, where I am to speak my conscience without fear of censorship. And at the same time, we need not agree, as Michelle alluded to in the story. While you've called me to lead a way, this is a free faith, and we are here by voluntary agreement in participation. What I speak is not a creedal test that you must adhere to, but you are called by your values in a free and responsible search for truth and meaning to listen as you are able, with open ears and open hearts, and then make your own judgments from there. So I've been asked to speak on the subject of abolishing the police today. And in truth, I was really glad to be asked to do this sermon topic, because I think this is a question we need to be examining here at FPC. In 2020, the UUA General Assembly voted to pass a statement titled, quote, "Amen to Uprising, a Commitment and Call to Action." That resolution stated the following: "Therefore, we will create systemic change within our congregations by revising agreements and policies to create alternatives to policing, including developing plans for safety and accountability, choosing not to involve police departments and deactivating security systems that mobilize police response when triggered, engaging in creative transformative justice processes, pursuing abolition of policing systems within the congregations and institutions in which we have power, moving congregational and institutional resources and empowerment towards Black liberation organizing and long-term redistribution, and rooting ourselves in the theologies of liberation and abolition." Now, at the time that this statement was up for proposal, some of our delegates, our FPC delegates to the General Assembly, chose to vote against this resolution because we were not sure that FPC would be in agreement with those goals. For one thing, we have had a really very friendly relationship with our local Stowe Police Department. Friendly enough that I was able to call up Chief Solis this week and talk to him about this sermon. But in 2020, I personally did vote for the resolution because I saw it as aspirational, as leading us forward, even though I had my own questions and doubts. And in the end, it passed overwhelmingly. And so it's a statement of our denomination, of our faith. And once I passed, I said, well, it is calling us to take action. And the first step in that action is informing ourselves on the issue, educating ourselves about why people are calling for police abolition. So I'm definitely glad that I got to study this, because this is a place where I didn't know if I agreed with where our faith is leading. And it's been my experience that this has happened many times, well, not many times, a few times before during my years as a minister. There are times when I lag behind in information, in experience, in comfort, or in commitment to where our faith is leading. This is one of those times. And what I've found historically is that when I examine those issues, where I differ from our faith, where I educate myself and really dive into what it's about, that I find that Unitarian Universalism was leading me, was teaching me something I needed to know, was taking me forward into a greater call for justice. So when I see myself lagging behind our faith on this issue, I think this is a time for me to learn, and maybe a time for me to grow. This was the case when our faith, for example, got involved in the issue of immigration justice. I lagged behind, not in agreement, but in commitment. I was like, yeah, that's an issue, but is it really where we should be putting our energy? I was wrong. Yes, we do need to put our energy into immigration justice. We have an active task force here at FPC doing just that. So here is where I am with police abolition. And what I personally think is I'm not ready to say yes to saying I believe in police abolition. I'm not ready to say yes until I know personally, firmly, what would replace it, the exact model that we're going to put into place. And of course, we're never going to know the exact model until we're at the point of voting and to implement such a model. But I've had the unfortunate experience of knowing people who were cruelly murdered, of knowing countless people who were raped, some by serial rapists, some by stranger rape. And I know enough people who are victims of violent crimes, and I have met some of the offenders, to say that I don't really see how we completely abolishing policing and still deal with the most violent offenders without replacing policing with something that looks an awful lot like policing, for at least that portion. And admittedly, it's a small portion of police work. I don't have the vision of how else it can work, despite reading numerous articles and books and listening to podcasts, etc., on police abolition. I just don't get it. When I talked with law enforcement, two things were pointed out to me that felt really true among their concerns with the idea of getting rid of policing. One was that, going back to that issue of violent crime, looking specifically at the issue of domestic violence. A U.S. Department of Justice report from 2009 titled Practical Implications of Current Domestic Violence Research states, quote, a major reexamination of a series of fairly rigorous experiments in multiple jurisdictions finds that arrest deters repeat reabuse, whether suspects are employed or not. In none of the sites was arrest associated with increased reabuse among intimate partners. Another major study based on 2,564 partner assaults reported in the NCVS from 1992 to 2002 found that whether police arrested the suspect or not, their involvement had a strong deterrent effect. It goes on to say it doesn't really depend on whether or not the victim was a third reported the incident or not. It doesn't depend on the seriousness of the assault. There are all these other factors. But that arrest and police involvement leads to a reduction in reabuse by domestic violence offenders. As someone who has seen domestic violence lead to tragedy, this makes a powerful argument for me in favor of policing alone. Now, is it possible that alternative systems could have the same deterrent effect? Yes, definitely. I'm not ruling that out. But I think to the cases, like the very tragic case of the very publicized Gabby Petito case this summer, police received a call about a domestic violence situation involving Gabby Petito and her fiancé, Brian Laundrie. They responded. They ultimately chose not to make an arrest. And Gabby was ultimately killed by Brian, who killed himself. And while there's lots to be said about how this case of a blonde white woman got more media exposure and attention than hundreds, maybe thousands of cases of women of color and indigenous women combined, it's still a case being pointed to where people are saying that if an arrest had been made, maybe a life might have been saved. The other strong argument that I believe complicates the issue of police abolition is one that is particular to rural and small communities. I can get firmly behind the idea that we have lumped too many ideas, too many things under the umbrella of policing. And we need to remove some things from under that umbrella, like mental health response, maybe some domestic violence response, response to all traffic violations, drug issues, sex trafficking, and cover them with other programs instead. And in larger urban areas, it's possible to see where a reduction of policing combined with a simultaneous increase in other services is a perfectly feasible situation. The problem is providing 24/7 coverage for all of these services. And in smaller and more rural areas where police forces are small, subdividing the tasks of policing could leave us without people to respond to that 3 a.m. true emergency. So those are the limitations I walk in with my understanding. But my faith is calling me to examine this issue and move forward. And in its exploration of the other side of the issue, I think that I need to personally do to grow in my understanding, in keeping with the theological underpinnings of the issue as well. So I want to examine the perspective of those who believe in abolishing the police. And at two levels. First is the issue of police reform, and then the level of police abolition. Because I think the reasons why we would argue that reform is needed is something on which we would find a greater agreement in here. And indeed, many of the police themselves believe in reform efforts. Chief Solis spoke to me about how he worked, along with others, to put in place restorative justice and jail diversion programs in our community, and he's a big believer in them. He spoke to me about how for a while, judges couldn't even choose a restorative justice option, and now they can, and that's a good thing. He also talked about how the use of force policy is an example where change was needed and change was made. Chokeholds are no longer allowed, and they made that change here locally in Stowe before it was required at a state level. Another great example in the local area is Ed Denmark, former chief of police, now retired for Harvard. He did some great work on trying to change the training of police officers, training early on to minimize conflict, to de-escalate. But at the same time, he found it wasn't easy to make change to such a large and entrenched field as policing in America. I think most of us can agree that reforms are needed. First of all, there are many ways we use policing to solve other societal problems, to make what some people see as problems go away and be hidden from our sight. We use policing in some areas to hide our homelessness problem by arresting the homeless for doing things that homeless people do, from loitering to sleeping in public places to public urination. We use policing to solve the problems of drugs by, instead of channeling money into drug rehabilitation programs, instead we arrest the addicts. We use policing to address the problems that the sex industry reveals, where there are exploitation issues of the vulnerable, issues of poverty, and hiding these problems through arresting sex workers. These are areas where reform in our system could address the issue easily in other ways. If we solve homelessness, we no longer need to use policing to arrest the homeless and hide them from our sight. The book Into Policing by Alex Vitale gives a good example of the police problems with arresting sex workers, giving this story. Quote, in 2015, the U.S. Attorney's Office in New York raided the offices of rentboy.com, a website where mostly male sex workers advertised their services. All of the employees were arrested, and the business shuttered, despite the absence of a single complaint from anyone using the site. The result was to drive these sex workers into more financially and physically precarious positions. The Rent Boy case is especially important because of the vulnerabilities faced by lesbian, gay, transgendered, and other gender nonconforming or unconventional sex workers. These sex workers are often at risk from clients, from police, and predators, and are more likely to operate at the margins of the sex trade. And as Ayobami Lanianu, a sociologist from the University of Toronto, says, quote, it strikes me as more pragmatic to provide a person suffering from serious mental illness with health care and perhaps a therapist than an armed police officer with little training. Our current model of policing asks police officers to handle situations that they are ill-equipped to handle, don't want to do, and don't do particularly well. So there are easy reforms to see in terms of what types of activities we police, and what things might be handed off to other agencies to address. Essentially, we could stop needing so much policing if we built up a stronger social safety net. But there are also issues we can point to about how policing itself as an institution is in need of reform. Too often, we hear of police who are connected to white supremacy organizations. As highlighted in the 2006 U.S. Department of Intelligence's report, quote, titled White Supremacist Infiltration of Law Enforcement. We know that all too often, policing takes on racist and sexist forms. We've seen the racism highlighted by the Black Lives Matter movement, with the deaths of Michael Brown, George Floyd, Tamir Rice, Philando Castile, Breonna Taylor, Eric Garner, and so many others at the hands of law enforcement. And it's not just that policing does have a racism problem. It also has a domestic violence problem. Alex Roslin, who wrote the book Police Wife, The Secret Epidemic of Police Domestic Violence, says, quote, a major study was done by a police officer and sociologist in Tucson, Arizona, working with a collaborator who had studied domestic violence in military families. It wasn't by the police department officially. That study found that 40% of cops reported having participated in domestic violence in the previous year. An FBI advisory board later found that roughly 40% of officers who filled out questionnaires in a number of different settings admitted to being physically violent with their spouse in the previous 6 months. These are issues that need to be addressed. They need to be addressed at the levels of recruitment, at the levels of training, and more. But the Abolish the Police movement, to turn to them, would go further and say, these are but the outward signs of a system that has been steeped in white supremacy and oppression from its inception. In the book An End to Policing, Alex Vitale lays out the history of policing and the limits on the idea of reform. Vitale points to the origins of policing. In the North, policing came from the British model and was created essentially for, quote, managing disorder and protecting the property classes from the rebel. Vitale writes, the London model was imported into Boston in 1838 and spread through the northern cities over the next few decades. Boston's economic and political leaders needed a new police force to manage riots and the widespread social disorder associated with the working classes. Policing in the North went on to be used to enforce the rules of capitalism with busting unions. Of course, in the South, the history is even worse, because the truth is that slavery, quote, was another major force that shaped early policing. When you think about the Jim Crow South, the fact that policing was used to uphold and enforce systems of power is readily apparent. I think of my colleagues' stories about the marches down in Selma. Here's the words of Black UU minister Mark Morrison Reed in his book, Selma Awakening, describing the experiences of Ira Blaylock and Gordon Gibson, two white UU ministers. He says, quote, the following Monday, when the black citizens of Selma once again marched to the courthouse to register, both Blaylock and Gibson joined them. Standing atop the courthouse steps, Sheriff Clark jammed his billy club into the belly of King's aide, James Bevel, pushing him down the stairs. The protesters were surrounded and arrested by, quote, deputized hooligans, unquote, wielding cattle prods and billy clubs. That day, 50 people were taken into custody, but it was the incarceration of two white UU ministers and a white Catholic lay theologian that made headlines. I've heard the stories of my colleagues standing nose to nose with that line of policemen, the threats of violence palpable as they fought for civil rights. Organizer Mariame Kaba puts it bluntly, so when you see a police officer pressing his knee into a black man's neck until he dies, that's the logical result of policing in America. When a police officer brutalizes a black person, he is doing what he sees as his job. To my white ears, that may sound harsh, and I recoil against it. But I also need to remember it's a lived truth for people of color. It's important to remember that this institution, this system of police that we have in America, it was created to uphold the establishment. And the establishment in the South was slavery. And the establishment in the North was a capitalism that used policing for anti-union work, for union busting, and worker control. And as such, the Abolish the Police movement's perspective is that this is a system rooted in oppression and fundamentally flawed. Christy Lopez, law professor at Georgetown, says succinctly, for me, the language of abolition is important because it reminds us that there are facets of policing that reflect and perpetuate America's longstanding use of state-sanctioned coercion, including violence, to control the bodies of black people. Advocates for abolition argue that reform has proven ineffective time and time again. I don't disagree. And yet, I'm still not sure that abolishing and replacing all the functions of policing that we would need to do is feasible. And I'm not sure what we could replace it with that wouldn't come out looking the same. But it is also clear to me that my faith is calling me forward. That whether or not I personally hold that vision, there is important work to be done. And whether or not we agree on the ultimate end goals, some of that work can be done now. Some of it can be done from within, with the help of the good folks that we've named here, police leaders with a vision for justice and a vision for change. Some of it will need to be done by making legislative reforms pushed for by the people. Ultimately, it might require an overturn of an entire system. I'm not sure where the work ends. But to that point, I don't think I need to know. I don't have to know the end to know we're at the beginning and there is work to be done. In the end, I look back to the UUA's final bullet point among those I read, rooting ourselves in theologies of liberation and abolition. And I think back to my understanding of the word abolition. Sure, it literally means just the action of abolishing something or the movement to abolish something. But we used that word primarily for slavery. And we mean an ending to an unjust system of oppression. So when I hear abolish the police, I can also hear we are working to overturn an unjust system rooted in oppression in regards to policing. And it's hard for me to really disagree with that. I still think we need some sort of system to deal with the most violent crimes, particularly repeat ones. But I also think we do need to end unjust systems rooted in oppression. And while I may not see the way forward to do both clearly myself, there are people working on this who do. And my lack of vision shouldn't stand in the way of progress. And that progress forwards begins with building up the systems that ultimately might replace policing. We start by building up the social safety net, building the systems for dealing with mental health, with drug use, with sex trafficking, homelessness, poverty, domestic violence, and more. I think we can all agree that it's no bad thing for us to work on the cause to end homelessness. We begin by changing our understanding of security so that security and safety is not about policing, but about the social safety net. We begin by building the world that we want to see, the world that we want to see in place. And then policing becomes less and less necessary. We all want that world, I think. I think even the police want a world where policing is less necessary. A world with less violence and less crime. A world with true security and true safety for all. A world rooted not in oppression, but in liberation. We all want to see us building a new way. And so we begin.
hum along.
Our closing words are by Audette Fulbright Folsom. Do not think we are finished. Oh no, we will never be finished until justice is done, until the light of justice is lit behind every eye. Do not think we will be silent. No, there will not be silence until the world has sung the names of the dead with full throats, and still we will sing on. Do not think fear is the end of us. Oh, you are broken in mind and heart if you even imagine that our fear for our lives is the end of this story. We are braver than you have ever conceived, and you will not be the end of us. We have come to take back the world that is the inheritance of better children, better lovers, better days. There will be love again, but justice is our demand now. You will not take us down. We are endless, fire-lit, determined, and we are coming. Maybe so.
Gonna keep on moving forward. Gonna keep on moving